Hello and welcome to the Mohit Show. Today we will be covering the topic of Black Lives Matter and its utter failure. First, I will be covering the destructive and violent riots which disproportionately harmed black people. Then, I will touch upon the corrupt nature of the nationwide leaders of Black Lives Matter. Next, I will cover how the movement itself has failed and killed more black people than the supposed problems they are trying to target. Finally, I will cover how Black Lives Matter as a movement has cruelly manipulated and divided the public through gaslighting and false emotional tactics. Before I start, I would like to clarify that I believe all races should be treated equally without prejudice. I do not believe or support in improper enforcement of the law, and I believe we can fix that by requiring our officers to go through more training than is required to become a barber in the US. Seriously, one can become a cop over a few months with much less training than many other developed countries. Now, on to the first segment, the violent protests and attempted insurrections of the Black Lives Matter movement and associated Antifa members. The violent riots in 2020 caused up to $2 billion in damage just from the insurance companies. And yes, they were violent. Nearly 570 violent riots were held in nearly 220 locations, among other non-violent gatherings. Many sites claim that the 93% peaceful rate is acceptable, though this number is inflated by the large number of small gatherings which were far less likely to be violent or lead to anything in general. Almost every major capital in the United States faced violent protests. Even then, the police have a 99.9% peaceful interaction rate, so by that logic, the police are much more peaceful. In reality, a 7% violence rate is an utterly unacceptable and devastating consequence. The violence and damage was senseless and primarily affected random bystanders. Even more concerning, since these protests often happened in primarily black parts of their cities, these riots disproportionately affected black owned businesses and communities. Violence may sometimes be necessary to achieve goals. However, I doubt the goals of Black Lives Matter were furthered by these actions. Some violent radicals are even calling looting reparations. Beyond this, the riots themselves have killed multiple people. While the numbers are debated due to media censorship of the situation, some estimates say that at least 25 people were killed in the riots. And let's not forget the armed Antifa attacks on the Oregon Capitol. While the US Capitol event didn't even consist of well armed individuals or significant property damage, in Portland, millions of dollars of damage were caused, while dozens were charged with illegal weapons and homemade explosives. Portland has a significantly greater claim to insurrection. And how could we forget Chaz or Chop, the literal secession from the United States, which became violent and utterly failed due to the impracticality of the ideas it was created on? These were not properly organized and goal oriented protests. They were simply senseless violence that only hurt those around them. All those who participated in the violence should rot in prison. However, most are allowed to go free. This is injustice. No rational or empathetic person should be able to support this insanity. To our next segment. The leadership of Black Lives Matter. While many claim the movement to be completely decentralized, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation is the first thing to come up when you search the group, and they received $90 million in funding. By the end of 2020, they only spent 30 million of that for uncharitable causes or on lower level charters. Where are the other $60 million left over? Well, some leaders use the donations for suits, properties, and weapons. One of the self proclaimed Marxist founders has a real estate portfolio worth over $3 million. She later resigned after people called out this hypocrisy. Then you have other leaders, like Tay Anderson, the de facto leader of the Denver BLM protests and the leader of the effort to remove police from Denver schools. He was also on the school board of Denver schools. He apparently raped at least 62 minors, 61 illegal immigrants. You also have John Sullivan, who was paid tens of thousands of dollars by CNN to attend the Capitol protests on January 6th. He can be seen on video dressed as a Trump supporter, egging people on with words like, "It's our house," and "We got to get this shit burned." At least some people are leaving, such as Rashid Turner, who founded the BLM chapter in St. Paul. He states that BLM has little concern for rebuilding black families and even less about improving the quality of education for students. He also highlights how the BLM organization webpages stated that they wanted to disrupt the nuclear family structure. Clearly, the groups oriented towards this cause do not have effective leadership. Next, possibly the most crucial segment, the harm that this movement has brought to black individuals. The biggest cause of this is the horrible decision to defund the police. New York police reduced arrests by 38% and their homicides increased by 58%. Chicago police have been subjected to countless restrictions and have seen a 58% decrease in arrests. Murders have increased by 65%. St. Louis is at a 50-year homicide high, and its rate is 3 times higher than Mexico or Central America. As Milwaukee slashed 120 police officers from their force, the city saw a 98% increase in killings. Last year, there were 20,000 murders in the US, up 4,000 or 25% from the previous year. There are more examples. Considering in a year, only roughly 250 black individuals were killed by the police in 2019, and only 12 of those individuals were unarmed, the amount of deaths caused by this movement greatly eclipses the issue they're trying to address. The Black Lives Matter movement has catastrophically failed by this, and the deaths they have caused with their flawed ideas are unacceptable. Now to the final segment, the manipulation and the hatred intrinsic to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter and their rhetoric has been consistent with only one thing: complete hatred for anyone who even slightly disagrees. In the recent climate, individuals who have seen problems in the movement have been silenced or have kept themselves silent due to fears of losing their jobs, their status, their relationships, and more. Anyone who says they do not identify with the movement is immediately branded as racist, possibly the worst adjective in modern discussion. Bringing up the fact that all lives matter and that the issues faced in society are not only faced by black people will get one branded as a far right extremist, a racist, and a fascist. In the modern world of political correctness, no businesses have taken the extreme risk of saying anything against the movement even as their buildings burn, and many have taken to a hollow appreciation of the movement for publicity. The worst aspect is that the media, being primarily controlled by companies that are violently afraid of being called racists, barely covered the violence and insanity which was happening. For example, you have CNN calling the protests mostly peaceful when arson and assault were committed. They deliberately stayed away from writing articles that paint the movement in a bad light. Many important stories I mentioned were not covered by many mainstream media sources. However, they still want to make content, and so thousands of articles praising the movement and its actions were made. Countless articles talking about how the protests are peaceful, or mostly peaceful. And for every argument against the protest, there were hundreds of quickly written and poorly researched articles claiming that nothing was wrong and any sources linked were just racist. And since speaking out against BLM gets one marked as far right and racist, the sources that covered this were marked as such and were already perceived as such, and many individuals would simply refuse to read from them. This creates an environment where only one set of ideas is exposed, and the other ideas are ridiculed and hated before even being considered. This is not healthy for society. Beyond that, on social media, individuals were allowed to spew hate and violent words. Social media trends about hating white people, assuming all police officers were horrible people, repeated attacks on any major figure which wasn't in clear support. All the while, the other side often were banned for their opinions. The media sites were more focused on censoring any mention of the lab leak, which was a legitimate theory, instead of actually handling the hate on their platform. This culture of exclusivity, a culture where violence and hatred are reserved for and excused for one group of people, is a culture that breeds the worst in humanity. For example, Jewish populations across the US were faced with a spike in anti Semitic attacks after the media only showed the Palestinian narrative in the recent conflict. Black celebrities like Deshaun Jackson posted false Hitler quotes and anti Semitic messages on their social media. Pro- Prominent leaders called Jewish people termites or just brutes. This community has gotten so corrupt that individuals are facing backlash for apologizing to the Jewish community for anti Semitic attacks, while others double down and defend their anti Semitism. People have died due to this hostility. This even extends to the recent anti Asian violence. Several of the attacks were tied to BLM supporters, and in general, the attacks were overwhelmingly statistically biased to be committed by black people. You can see the gaslighting behavior again in the media response to this. The media heavily focused on race of the Atlanta shooter and used the single event to pin the Asian violence issue on white supremacy, despite the attack not being exclusively on Asians or particularly tied to white supremacy in any fashion. Whereas the media is still trying to cover up the primary race of these Asian attackers, some sites even claiming that hate crime isn't hate crime if the individual is black, and others claiming that the crimes were white supremacist conspiracy and were faked. BLM is not a movement of progress. It is a regressive movement of hatred. One without legitimate goals or leadership. One that has led to thousands of deaths. One that has warped society to bend to its will. BLM is a hateful cult and should be discarded with prejudice. This has been the Mohit Show. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for this channel if you want more content in the future. Have a good day.